Welcome to Where the Ramp Ends. I am Summer Parrish, and I'm here today with my co host, Bryce. And we are joined today with special guest, Al Condeluci, an author, speaker, and longtime leader in the disability community. Al is the author of Social Capital, The Key to Macro Change, and The Essence of Interdependence, Building Community for Everyone, and other books that challenge us to rethink independence and instead focus on relationships, dignity, and belonging. For decades, his work has pushed systems and all of us to stop trying to fix people and start building stronger, more inclusive communities. Thank you, Al, for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it on to Bryce.
All right. Thank you, Summer. And again, welcome, Al. It's good to see you again, my friend. So, my very first question for you is a very simple one. What drew you to advocacy? And if you could tell our listeners kind of a brief overview of why advocacy and why public speaking.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks so much for the opportunity to be a part of your podcast series, Summer and Bryce. So delighted to be with you. I really am humbled by the invitation, and was really looking forward to our conversation today. And Bryce, to your question, your introductory question is sort of what sort of led me down the path of advocacy is it really goes back to my childhood. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and grew up in a large Italian family. Our family actually lived on a hill that overlooks Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is, of course, pretty hilly. It's right at the tail end of the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and so our family kind of grew up together, or right, in fact, on the street where I grew up was 8 Condeluci families. And my next door neighbors and neighbor across the street, I mean, everybody was a Condeluci on our street. And so kind of growing up, I was, mostly grew up with my cousins and of course my own siblings, but my cousin, Carrie, who lived right, on the hill with us, she and I were the same age. Carrie's a year older than me, but she had Down syndrome, and um, and so as we were growing up as kids, that the kinds of things that she experienced, didn't go to school, really didn't have a whole lot of friends other than our family. Carrie was, oftentimes when we went off the hill, kids would tease her, and it was pretty powerful exposure at a very young age that really targeted me for, for being an advocate. I remember almost as far back as I can think, sharing that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to help people um, be accepted and valued
Sure.
and have opportunity. And so that's really been my path. That that goes all the way back to, I mean, our childhood in the 50s is when we grew up together, Carrie and I. So that's really what led me to the path. And you know, I think there's some really interesting similarities to the devaluation that people with disabilities have experienced, that other groups have experienced. I think you can make some really direct comparisons to the whole civil rights movement and
Right.
how folks of color were treated and that effort. So as an advocate, it's really been interesting for me, although my main practice has been in the disability arena. Um, there's been so many, um, connecting points with other advocacy movements, racial equality, women's rights, you know, immigrant rights, other kinds of groups of people who have been persecuted or have been polarized. So I think, advocacy, although my roots are in disability equality, that equality is equality, and I think any person who is devalued should have an opportunity to express himself and to be accepted in the course of and that's what America is about, right?
Right.
America is really about freedom and equality. All men are created equal. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. So
It kind of comes
that's what
down
got me
to
here, Bryce.
it kind of comes down to human rights. We all
Yes.
have.
And I think, to Al's point, I think, in time we have kind of gotten lost in translation and we've kind of forgot what that means. And I hope that our listeners and the world, gets a small perspective on we all are the same. We all want the same quality of life, just like everybody else.
That's
And
exactly right, Bryce. I mean, and the the whole notion of the difference that sometimes causes polarization, whatever it might be, the difference of a religious expression, or the difference of somebody's racial background, or the difference gender wise, um, disability. Those differences are so minimal compared to our similarities,
yes,
that we all want to be respected. We want to be valued. We want the opportunity. We want to participate. We want to work. The similarities just so outweigh the differences. Yet in some perverted kind of reality, people make a big deal about the difference, and that difference can become like a lightning rod that
yes,
literally has led way to people really being you know, being disconnected from all the rest of us. So I really agree with you. It really is about human rights, and that's sort of where I come from and how I perceive the world.
So you were in this unique position to see somebody's rights, your cousin Carrie. So she was, you saw her not being able to go to school and being bullied, and so you witnessed that firsthand, and that sparked you to go down a road that you've been on your entire life, basically. Can you kind of tell us, like, because you went one approach, somebody would tell you, to go down this way, um, and that didn't work. You want to tell us a little bit about your journey in advocacy and
Yeah, yeah. Summer, that's really a good question. The and I think it can boil really down um, to relationships and attitudes that are developed through relationships. When we're born and we begin to grow up, we're in a family, and our family becomes our first sort of social capital, or relationships patterns that we establish, and so we just begin to assume or accept the attitudes and perceptions and values that our family exhibits, right? And then as we get a little bit older, through relationships, as we begin to meet different people or new people in our journey, um, those people begin to influence us, Sociologists call it social influence theory, right? And through our relationships, we begin to broaden as people as we meet new people. I give an example. I grew up, as I said, on a hill with all my family, Catholic, poor, lower middle class. We weren't economically, really, powerful people. We were essentially poor, and so that was my world, right? And then even in school, starting in elementary school and high school, it was mostly our community. Our town is called McKees Rocks, and it was basically blue collar folks, ethnic differences, of course, but but I didn't meet that many different people as I was growing up. It was actually when I went off to college, when I got exposed to real diversity, people with very different religious kinds of backgrounds, and people with different perspectives, and so as I began to navigate through those relationships, those kinds of things began to broaden, and so some of the values that I grew up with really got challenged a bit or got tested. They were different. What my parents told me about different racial groups or different religious groups um, was when I began to meet people from those categories that were different from me and began to discover that, I'd meet somebody different from me at a party, and it was almost like, well, this person's they're just like me. So they're a different color, or so they wear a different style, or maybe they have a different functionality. They want what I want, so that kind of exposure through relationships, and that's why social capital is such an important ingredient to growth and to fulfillment, is that it really exposes you to this broader framework of life. And so my attitudes and my values began to shift a bit or change, or I like to think broaden, actually. And so I would get teased. I'd come back home from college during holidays and whatnot, and I was trying to utilize some of the things that I was learning, and that was, my family was still where they started from. So I began to broaden, and part of that broadening was, okay, accept my family for who they are, how they believe, what they believe, but that doesn't really mean that I have to believe it now.
Right.
Right.
The relationships that I began to get began to test or change that. Was certainly true with disability issues, because, the assumption we make about somebody who has Down syndrome, or the assumption we make somebody who has cerebral palsy, or somebody who has, some other type of disability, the assumptions that we make based upon, the exposure that we had, about that kind of reality, really got tested as I met, people who had very, very, challenging disabilities, but wanted the same thing that I wanted. It was so seeing those kinds of things and beginning to incorporate those into my life, I think really helped me begin to understand who I am and where I find myself in this greater scheme.
That's a good
For
seg
Go ahead,
that's a
Bryce.
that's a good segue because you talk about social capital, and Summer and I were talking about that prior to you coming on. We were talking about how you said in Partners in Policymaking that the average person with a disability has between usually 50 social interactions, and a normal able-bodied person per se has 150 so social connections. Can you elaborate to our listeners what exactly you mean by that?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Bryce. You're referring to when we first met, I was talking about social capital, and I was giving a little bit of a framework in understanding social capital, and first off, social capital, that sounds like a big phrase, but it just means friendships. It's relationships in our life. That's really what it means, and as sociologists and anthropologists have studied relationship patterns for of human beings, one of the things that we're learning about social capital is that there, from a quantity point of view, like how many friends or how many relationships we have, it is somewhat capped. I mean, we have the capacity to know a lot of people, but we don't have enough time to really begin to engage with all those people that we meet. So time begins to temper the quantitative side of social capital. And so this idea that you mentioned, 150 relationships in our lives, comes really right out of studies that have been done. Robin Dunbar is the anthropologist who really began to codify that notion about 150. But what Dunbar says in his work, and he's out of the UK, Cambridge University, he says that we have this we have these limitations both in terms of the limbic system of our brain, as well as the time that we have to relate. And so he postulates that, the typical person has about 150 relation or can build about 150 relationships in their lives where they have some obligation to the other person. Like for example, you and I met just this past year, and we were chatting during the break in that session, and you told me a little bit about this podcast, and I said, oh, that's great. And so then I left Louisiana. I came back to Pittsburgh, and you reached out to me and said, would you like to be a guest on our podcast, right? And so I said, yeah, I'd love that. I'd love to be a part of that. So that notion of your ability to reach out to me, somebody you just met for the first time, in a session we were together at, um, made me feel somewhat obliged to participate in the podcast, right? So having relationships begins to open doors for other things. It doesn't mean that when I say obligation, it doesn't mean that like I had to, but it meant that I wanted to, right?
Right,
And so with obligation, social obligation, if you think about your own life and think about the people in your life, how many people might you reach out and ask a favor or ask for some assistance with something that would be
right,
willing to do it, willing to, to connect with you around that particular issue that you invite. So when you begin to think about relationships, you start to think about who are the people in my life that I could go to um, for something, or if I have a problem, or if I have, or if I have good news I want to share, who could I go to share that good news with, right? And
right,
that begins to kind of create a little bit more of not just a bridging, but a bonding that happens between people. And bridging social capital is just the connection, right? That's the fact that we met at Partners in Policymaking. We're disability advocates, and we were able to bridge that to get to this point, to this
Right.
conversation we're having right now. But if we had more time and we saw each other more regularly, we would begin to be able to do more things together. And as we do more things together, we would begin to create more of a bond, right?
Yes.
So a bridge creates the first connection. A bond really begins to create the greater obligation that we
Yes.
have to each other.
And I think that's a good point, Al. I think that's the culmination of the disability community. We all need to bond together and figure out how a way to collaborate and make the life that we all want, because that is truly what we are all searching for, is people to bridge the gap with. And I'm so excited to be able to create a bond with fellow advocates and fellow influencers in the disability community and try to er eradicate change as much as we can.
So, Al, can
Yeah,
you go
yeah.
into, because you
That's
have some fabulous ideas. It's a little daunting. So, my daughter's 5 years old. She's getting ready to be 6. She has Down syndrome. So, one thing I hear a lot of parents kind of in my position talk about is, like you take your child to the park or take them, where other children are. And there's this disconnect because the other kids are kind of shy away from your child. And so that's something, like there is this big deficit of people with disabilities versus um, able bodied people, the social capital. And that's one reason why there's this um, people shy away. And so, can you go into some
yeah.
thoughts on how to create those bridges for your loved ones or for yourself if you have a disability? What give us some advice on how to help our kids or help ourselves build those bonds or build those bridges.
Yeah. Well, that's really a great point, and what you really just implied is part of human nature. We tend to find ourselves seeing difference, and difference, psychologically, difference, whatever we might see that's different, creates a sort of a pushback, right? If you see something you've never seen before, and so you don't really understand it, your first reaction is to back away a little bit and try to get a better sense of what is this different thing, right? um so and that's basically a defense mechanism that we've been coded with as human beings. So if we see something we've never seen before, or essentially we back away and say, is this going to harm me? Is this going to be a problem for me? Is this going to be something I want to stay away from, right? So difference creates a pushback. Interestingly enough, the opposite of that is similarity, right? Similarity draws us together. So when you talk about your daughter having Down syndrome, that is a connection for me because I grew up with my cousin who had Down syndrome. So that similarity draws me to you. It pulls me to you, right? So similarities attract and differences repel, right? So I think the best advice in thinking about relationship building is to really think about, what does your daughter have in common with other 5-year-olds, with other 10-year-olds, or whatever age range? What do they have in common, right? And where can those similarities create a bridge between us, as opposed to the differences that push us away? A lot of other families who have 5-year-old daughters that don't have Down syndrome, don't have really much of an experience there, right? So when they see your daughter, that difference sort of, pushes them back just a little bit. Not that they're mean about it or not that they're being malevolent. It's just that it's different experience. And so they back away from you thinking, oh, poor Summer, she's dealing with this really challenging situation. Her daughter has got Down syndrome and my daughter doesn't. So I'm gonna just back away and give her some space, right? And that's exactly the opposite of what you want, right? You want to find bridges. So my recommendation is really for people to think about what do they have in common, what what and how can we find places where people celebrate that commonality, right? So, so that in theory, if you think about sociological theory and you think about differences pushing us away, similarities attracting us, it begins to get us to think about strategies that are built upon finding things we have in common and finding things if we are personally have a disability, um, what are some of the things we share with other people as opposed to the fact that other people don't have a disability and I have a disability? That that also is one of the reasons why congregation of people with disabilities has become sort of an approach. If you look at almost all human service structure, um, it creates separation. Like you have United Cerebral Palsy for people with cerebral palsy, and you have the Down Syndrome Association for people with Down syndrome, and you have the Parkinson's Foundation for people who have Parkinson's, and so we get this separation, thinking that the only bridge your daughter has is Down syndrome. And that's wrong. That's not true. Your daughter has hundreds of other similarities
Right.
to people. So I think we don't want to go into that black hole of just being with other people with disabilities and people with the same disability. I mean,
Right.
there's differences in disability. So so we don't want to get pigeonholed, right? We want to sort of look at what kinds of things do we like or does our daughter like and care about and is interested in, and where are other kids gather who like that same thing, and how can they be together in celebration of that same thing as opposed to being typecast as being just different and needing to be with their own kind.
I'll tell you a little story about this past weekend, and it's kind of led me to, um, well, I'll just go into the story. But so this past weekend, she was in a fashion show with the Down Syndrome Association, our local Down Syndrome Association. And, we gussied her up and she was beautiful and she took her out to the stage and she was supposed to, like go to the end and pose and turn around and leave. Well, she got to the end and she broke out into full out tap dancing. She doesn't know how to tap dance. She's never, in her life, but she just loved that spotlight and she just danced and danced and we had to drag her off the stage. And afterwards, I thought, I think maybe we need to get into dance lessons. And I thought that's something that I think Al would approve of, is getting her into a dance class with other typical kids, because that would be something she has in common with those other
Yeah,
girls, is her
that's right. That's
love
exactly
for
right.
dance.
Well, that's such a great story, Summer. And let me actually tell you a similar story. This was years ago, right? The agency I was working with was trying to get people connected in community, right? And following things that they like. And one of my colleagues, one of my fellow staff members was working with a family who had a daughter with Down syndrome who wanted to be a ballerina, right? And, um, and so, we're thinking, okay, you know, sometimes little girls want to be ballerinas. That's fine. Where do budding ballerinas go, and where do families go who have children who want to be ballerinas? And so there's the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, and they have a school here in Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh Ballet Theater. And so my colleague who was working with this family who had a daughter who wanted to be a ballerina went to the Pittsburgh Public Ballet Theater School, and had a conversation with the person who matriculates kids into the ballet theater, and their class. And when the person from the ballet theater um, discovered that their daughter had Down syndrome, she backed away and said, well, "You know what? Maybe you want to talk with the Association for retarded children." That was the term that was used. This was a number of years ago.
Right.
The ARC, and maybe they can start a little ballerina program for kids with Down syndrome, little girls who want to, or little and boys who want to be ballerinas. And so we basically had kind of pushed back and said, well, no, she wants to be a ballerina. You folks teach ballerina, lessons that, so, but their first reaction was, no, she just wouldn't fit here. Our instructors wouldn't know how to teach her. Well, their instructors know how to teach ballet.
Right.
So what, and here's, a girl that wants to have, learn ballet. And so, the knee jerk reaction is, well, she's a different species and needs to go to a different place. So that's a mindset that's out there that can really put up barriers, right, to inclusion, to being a part of something. Now, being going becoming if for families, sometimes it's easier for them to go to the ARC and say, gee, can you set up a ballerina class? My daughter wants to study ballet, and the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater school won't accept her, so will you do that? And agencies will say, okay, we'll get a grant and we'll put together a little ballet class for kids with Down syndrome. And so the beat goes on. The beat of separation goes on. And so the other kids who don't have disabilities will never get to meet, your daughter.
Exactly.
And it
There's two sides of
it's
the
so
coin. Yeah.
narrow. It's such yeah,
Because
yeah,
if you had never
Summer, I
had
think
the experience with your cousin, you would have missed out on your calling. So
yes,
there's definitely two
that's right.
sides.
And
There's there's two sides of the coin there. There's everybody's
yeah,
missing out when there's
yeah,
separation.
Right.
there's two sides of the coin. That's such a good point, because there is two sides of the coin. There's the one side of the coin, and that is your daughter getting to meet all kinds of new people, and the other side of that coin is these other kids getting to meet your daughter and getting to can know her, as a girl and as a woman. Eh, and both things lead to growth, right? And so I think it's so important that we advocates continue to push the envelope of
Yes.
inclusion, of wanting to be a part of something, of wanting to participate in this bigger world, right? And I think some forward-thinking things are happening on that, Summer. Let me tell you about there's a organization in Toronto that I've worked with, and they that's a little community in the greater Toronto area. The community is called Mississauga, and when I went up, I went up and I did similar training to what we did at the Partners in Policy, talking about macro change. How do we change a community to be more accepting than fix a person with a disability to fit into what exists right now? How do we make the tent bigger so that all people can participate just as they are and not have to change, but that we change the environment, right? And so I did this training with their staff on macro change. And one of the things that we ended up doing was began to try to get to systems in Mississauga that are out there doing things. And one of the places we ended up going to was the Mississauga Recreation Center, the rec center in the town of Mississauga. And what we did is we said, boy, the rec center creates opportunity for people to learn new recreational skills and participate in all kinds of recreational things. And so maybe the rec center can become more inclusive and broaden its curriculum so that people with disabilities who want to learn, I don't know, the things that they teach at the rec center, archery or, dance or whatever things can actually teach, folks who have been traditionally left behind and not have an opportunity, right? And the rec center's first reaction was, well, we don't know how to help people with disabilities. We don't know anything about disability. We said, you don't have to know much about disability. All you have to do is just kind of create a more creative, adaptive way of serving everybody, right?
Right.
So basically, we did training. I did training at the Mississauga Rec Center for all their faculty members, and they're faculty members who teach skating and archery and the various classes that they offer at the rec center. And all we did was just talk about how do we make this sport or this activity, how do we make it available to everybody? Like, what adaptions or what changes can we make to the physicality so that more people can participate? And for the rec center, this was a win-win situation, because for the rec center, it meant new people enrolling, and they wanted to get more people enrolling in their classes. So it meant more people, signing up. It meant more revenue for the rec center. And it also made the rec center more dynamic. It made the teachers more creative. And so that's a macro strategy, a macro change. It would be like changing the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater School to be more inclusive so that they're teaching more kids the introduction to ballet. And even if your daughter doesn't end up becoming a ballerina, she meets new kids. She teaches them a little bit about, who she is. She learns about who they are, and she discovers that she'll maybe have a love for ballet, maybe not as a participant, but as somebody who can enjoy ballet, which
Right.
happens. That's most of what actually happens when people get introduced to something anyway. They don't end up being a pro at it. They
Right.
just get exposed and they begin to love it, and it adds color to their life. So I'm thinking more inclusively, I think is a really important strategy for disability advocates. And this podcast, where the ramp ends. That's exactly, that's a perfect metaphor for this kind of inclusive strategy. And because at the end of the ramp is life, is the world. You know, what you guys are doing as advocates is just incredibly laudable because you're really saying, how do we change the world so that at the end of the ramp is participation, is building new friendships, is, you know, having a chance to feel better about myself, is, you know, is all these good things.
Wow, that's real, like, accolades coming from you as, like, I'm gonna be
Yeah,
on
I'm
cloud
kind of
9 all
taken back.
day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's. I mean, I think you're doing the right thing by raising consciousness, and because lots of times the actual changes aren't that big of a deal. You know, I mean, with archery at the rec center, it was just creating a little stand so the person didn't have to, you know, hold the
Right.
bow and bring it back. You know, that stand held the bow, and all the person did was pull the arrow back and let it fly. You know, so it
It can be so
it
simple.
wasn't like this. Yeah, it wasn't this complex, hard thing. It was just a simple, you know, little carpenter who built these, you know, stands that held the bows.
But, I think that's a good point that a lot of people don't understand, Al, is they think that disability accommodations cost lots of money and they're very complicated. A lot of the disability accommodations, ladies and gentlemen, can be created for just a few dollars and a lot of ingenuity. It's
Exactly right, Bryce. That's exactly right. Where there's a will, there's a way. And it doesn't have to, man. Families know this because they figure this out in their own house, how to, you know, how to we make this house more accommodating
yes,
for the people who live here, right?
correct.
The members of this family. So it's not, I mean, there can be sophisticated things that
Sure.
are out there. In fact, you know, I teach at the University of Pittsburgh, and we have I teach in the School of Health and Rehab Sciences, and we have a division called the Human Engineering Research Lab, HERL, Human Engineering Research Lab. And so we have all these engineers, many of them who use wheelchairs themselves, you know, coming up with some very complex, you know, engineered stuff to make life more livable for people. You know, there's some really sophisticated stuff, no question about it. But on the other side of the coin is exactly the point you make, Bryce, and that is some changes are really simple. They're not big giant deals, right?
Right.
So when it does require something more complex, we should have support for families, foundational support or money
Yes.
available so families can get that more sophisticated stuff if they need it to be more sophisticated. But on the other side of the coin, a rehab engineer, you know, my colleagues at Pitt who teach, engineering, these guys and gals are just incredibly creative, and most of the time they come up with solutions that are simple, that are easy to do and easy to add to make to make the environment more
Right.
accepting.
And I think that it's a testament to if you really want to see change, you're gonna have to be an active participant in the creation of change.
Yes,
Like
yeah, I think so.
I remember when Summer and I cultivated this project, I told her a story that my dad used to say when I was growing up. You can't complain about what's going on in life if you're not willing to be a person at the table fighting for that change.
Yes, right, right. It really is. You know, it really is. I think there's two thoughts I have here. One is that creative notion of starting the examination of something by what will it take for Bryce to join us in this activity, right? What it would take. and then begin to sort of back into, well, how do we then make that happen, kind of thing. The other reality, though, Bryce, that I want to add so that the listeners to our podcast today can also be expansive in this, is that um, environmental change, macro change, culture change, um, is both physical and attitudinal, right? There's two dimensions to it. There's certainly the physical piece, where the ramp, putting a ramp in, that's something physical. But there's also attitudinal change. And, folks, for example, with that are on the spectrum, that perhaps are sound sensitive or light sensitive, um, uh, that if just having the right attitude, that let's be sensitive to the light, so that if somebody that's in our circle has a problem with light or has a problem with loud sounds, how can we mute those or lessen those so that they can feel okay about being with us, being a part of what we do? So, the whole notion of um, I was at a yeah, I spoke at this autism conference, and instead of clapping, people just did, they shook their hands to celebrate something that they want to acknowledge, so that, because the loud hand clapping really disturbed some of the people in the audience, right? So so it's just something simple like that, that just requires having the right attitude or the sensitivity to want to be inclusive. And a lot of
That's
times
so
people just don't know, so they don't, just how, as advocates, our challenge is, how do we communicate um, some change, some attitudinal change, or some accessibility change, some physical change? How do we communicate that to the real world, so that they won't feel like we're in their face,
right.
or that we're somehow, some way, demanding something, or we're going to sue them if they don't do that. That polarizing
I
sort of
w
stuff that can happen.
I will say I have evolved, and partners kinda help me evolve my approach, and just taking Julia to the playground. Initially, I'd take her and kids would kind of shy away, and I'd get upset. That hurts my feelings, my daughter's being rejected. And so I kinda, get a chip on my shoulder a little
Sure.
bit. And then now, when I take her, I see a kid shying away, I'll approach the parent and, I'll kind of get down on the child's level with the parent there and say, just explain to them, Julia has Down syndrome, so she might communicate a little different, but she still would love to play with you. And sometimes, there's kids that I wouldn't even try to do that with. And it's kind of um, and, we don't really have time to get into it, but looking for that gatekeeper. I kinda,
Yes.
look for a gatekeeper, even just taking her to the playground. And so, yeah, it is on me as her mom a little bit, to have that right attitude in order to, try to recruit attitudes among the community.
Yeah. Summer, what a great point you're making, because sometimes, and we started our conversation talking about, how do we become the advocates that we are, right? And oftentimes, people think advocates, are, got their, got their megaphone, and they're yelling, and that they're demanding, and sometimes advocacy requires that, but advocacy can be gentle. You can advocate in gentle ways, just getting people to begin to think, recognizing, if this was me, how would I want to be talked to, right? And how would I want to be approached about something? And so, that golden rule, if I was on the other side of this issue, how would I want to how would I how would I want to make sure I save face so
Right.
that we don't make people feel like they're dumb or they're insensitive or they're stupid. Sometimes they are, but we don't want to make them feel that way, right? So in strategies, we begin to think about how do we communicate, articulate issues, how can we demonstrate ways that will get people to think differently, in terms of recognizing and welcoming Julia into into the space. Most of the time the persons that are obstructionists aren't mean spirited. Sometimes they are, but most of the times they're not. They're not
Right.
mean spirited. They're not trying to deny or be obstinate. It's just that they just don't understand. And when you get somebody into a corner, they're going to just fight, and they're going to fight tooth and nail with you. So as advocates, I think we've just got to be savvy and recognizing that, and give the benefit of the doubt, but don't just accept second class citizenship. We give the
Right.
benefit of the doubt, but then at some point when it's really clear that the person is an obstructionist, then we got to be willing to come forward with some things that might be more potent. So when you look at the whole the yeah there's a whole cascade of strategies, efficacy strategies, that go from the most benign to the most aggressive, right? To get arrested, to get in somebody's face. I mean, look what's happening in Minneapolis, and you look at the resistance that's unfolding to these pretty, I mean, I think you get any level-headed person who's worried about immigration to say it's not right to raid somebody's home and separate I mean, it's just not right, right? I mean, I know that we have, we want to deal with immigration. I get that. But can't we do it in a way that's going to be sensitive to humanity? I think
Right.
we can. I think we're smarter and brighter to be able to do stuff like that. So in some ways, when we look at this whole cascade of strategies we have as advocates, we can recognize that we start with the softest, and then if those soft ways of trying to get change to happen doesn't materialize, then we ratchet up a little bit, right? So it's a long haul. I wrote a book a couple years ago. I don't know if you guys saw the book. It's called the Macro Change Handbook, and it's a book about advocacy, right? And it's about really using different advocacy tension at different parts of the challenge, and thinking about we don't want to embarrass people, but we might have to at the end of the day. So we go as softer at first and really try to ally with people.
Right.
But some folks that just get into a corner, get angry, or maybe just some people are mean spirited. That there are some of those people out there. I think they're minority, but sometimes they're the most vocal or the most um, angry, and we got to, as advocates, we got to deal with that, but we can't lose our temper initially. We got to be temperate as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, Al, we're gonna wrap it up a little bit. I'm gonna let Bryce ask any final questions he has, and then let you give your final thoughts. I just so appreciate you being here today. Like, I am a huge fan of yours. I probably have told 100 people about Al Condelucci. If you haven't heard Al Condelucci or read one of his books, you got to go do it. So, Bryce, you have a final question for Al?
My final thought would be, you know, what's the biggest takeaway that you want our listeners to take away from your time in advocacy when your career is over and you're, retired and able to, you know, be finished in advocacy? What do you want Al Condeluci's legacy to be
Yeah.
remembered as?
Well, thank you, Bryce. And first off, let me, as we finish up with this question, let me also thank you guys for this opportunity and for the kind invitation to be a part of your energy and your work. The things that you're doing is so important. The exposure, and so I'm just really happy and humbled to be with you guys today. But from a sense of legacy, that's such a powerful question, Bryce, because um, the the notion of our passage in life, right? I mean, we're as the older you get, the more you begin to reflect on, your purpose, like what's your purpose in life, and have you mattered? And is the world a little bit better because of something you've done? And and so I think though when I think about my own legacy, when I kind of turn that around and think about that, it really gets to those points, right? That I'm just hopeful that that the work that I've done and the life that I've led, because it's not just work, it's lifestyle, right? It's how I choose to be as a human with other people that I interact with. I just hope that, you know, that folks really feel that through something I've done, either some conversation or maybe something they've read or, something that I've initiated, caused them to think just a little bit differently about their humanity, about the fact that everybody out there wants the same thing. We all want to be loved. We want to be appreciated. We want to be celebrated. We want to matter, right? All people want that. Doesn't matter who you are or how you sort of entered this world or what happens to you while the life is unfolding. And I'm just hopeful that maybe some of the things that I've done have caused people to think just a little bit more about being more human. So
Wow.
so I think that's it, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunities that I've had to meet folks like you, and to have shared ideas and shared, the ups and downs of life with you, as we work to change the world.
Well, I think that's a wonderful end, and I cannot wait till we can collaborate again because I guarantee you this is not our last episode together on Where the Ram Ends. We'll have to come for a part two because this has just been too fantastic. And if you want more from Al, just drop it down in the comments and we'll have him back here shortly for Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce.
And I'm Summer.
This is Where the Ramp Ends and where your journey begins. Till next time.